This video offers a brief introduction to Chaucer's masterpiece, the Canterbury Tales. Chaucer wrote the Canterbury Tales at the end of the 14th century, roughly speaking between 1380 and 1400. The premise for the Canterbury Tales is the concept of pilgrimage. Pilgrimage is a rich notion that could mean multiple things during the Middle Ages. Let's start with the way pilgrimage functioned as a metaphor. Metaphor is one of the IDs that may appear on the final, so you might want to write this down. Metaphor is a literary device that is central, perhaps the most central literary device to literary criticism. And indeed, metaphor is central to the way all languages work. In terms of its etymological roots, the word metaphor means carry across or transfer. We'll take as our starting point in class literary critic Kenneth Burke's pithy definition of a metaphor, which is, quote, a device for seeing something in terms of something else. So a metaphor is a literary device in which one thing helps us see or comprehend another thing. Pilgrimage, literally, that is not metaphorically, referred in the Middle Ages to a journey to some kind of holy Christian destination. But pilgrimage was also a loaded metaphor during the medieval period. When understood metaphorically, pilgrimage supported stereotypical notions about the medieval period. Remember, the stereotype of the Middle Ages is that it is a time of pre-humanism, when people cared little about themselves as humans living on Earth. According to the stereotype, medieval people focused more on God, Jesus, other members of the Holy Family, and the afterlife. We can understand that dynamic in terms of the following dualisms. Medieval thinking was immensely dualistic. That is, it was driven by binary oppositions, as is much of our thinking and conceptualization of the world today. Here I've aligned two dualisms or oppositions: God and man, heaven and earth. I've also hierarchized them. I've put one on top of the other. I've placed heaven and God on top to indicate the stereotypical idea of the medieval period as a time when the divine and the afterlife were far more important than the life of man on earth. Going back to pilgrimage as a metaphor, a widespread notion in medieval England was the idea that life is a pilgrimage. Okay, do you see the metaphor there? We're shedding light on the way life works by thinking of it in terms of something else, pilgrimage. This notion actually appears in the Canterbury Tales. In the very first Canterbury tale, tells his son, Theseus, this world nis but a thoroughfare full of woe, and we ben pilgrims passing to and fro. This world is nothing but a thoroughfare of woe, and we are pilgrims passing to and fro. If you want to pause, you could pause the video and just take a moment and read carefully these two lines and think about them and how they might relate to the stereotype of a pre-humanist Middle Ages. The passage supports that stereotype, right? It's dissing the world, right? This world is nothing but a thoroughfare of woe. There's nothing good in this world, right? It's all bad. And we are just pilgrims on earth. So the stress here isn't on life on earth. Earth is just a waiting station until one gets to the place that truly counts, right? The afterlife. While this idea of life as a metaphor does appear in the Canterbury Tales, literally the Canterbury Tales concern an actual pilgrimage, right? An actual pilgrimage to the shrine to St. Thomas Becket in Canterbury in England. We can take as our starting point another binary, the opposition of the sacred to the profane. Pilgrimage had many sacred or holy valences or meanings. Going on a pilgrimage was about manifesting one's devotion to God and to maybe a particular holy figure, such as Thomas Becket. Becket was a martyr. He was killed in Canterbury Cathedral centuries before Chaucer wrote the Canterbury Tales. He was killed because of his devotion to the medieval Christian church. So officially, these pilgrims are going to Canterbury to pay their respects to Thomas Becket. But there were also very profane, worldly, or earthly reasons why people would go to Canterbury on pilgrimage. We can understand this partly by thinking about the etymological roots of pilgrimage. Etymologically, pilgrimage refers to words about travel. So pilgrimage is all about travel, and pilgrimage indeed was the prime excuse one could have to go on a trip. In other words, pilgrimage was the closest thing to a vacation in the medieval period. And indeed, as one headed out on pilgrimage and one was at the pilgrim destination, there was a lot of distinctly unholy or profane entertainment that makes clear just how much pilgrimage was a vacation during the Middle Ages. So there were opportunities to gamble, there was prostitution, like vacations these days, people hawked souvenirs. So we could easily compare going on pilgrimage to Canterbury to an American taking a road trip to a place like Disneyland or Las Vegas. Las Vegas is especially apt. Pilgrimage created a liminal, extraordinary space where the usual social strictures were loosened. For these sorts of reasons, there were people who criticized pilgrimage. You can remember the Lollards or Wycliffites. I brought them up in the last video. The Lollards emphasized this idea of pilgrimage as a metaphor. For the Lollards, the only kind of pilgrimage anyone should really go on is a pilgrimage of the spirit, an effort to do good things, to praise God, and get to heaven. All right, let's talk about the organization of the Canterbury Tales. In the general prologue, Chaucer sets the scene. He establishes the premise of the Canterbury pilgrimage, and he inserts himself as a character. Okay, this is a literary move. This doesn't mean that Chaucer literally went to the Tabard Inn and met all of these pilgrims. He's creating a character. In this character, Chaucer, who goes to this inn, the Tabard Inn, basically a pub. The character is apparently very social. He manages to meet personally all of the pilgrims who are going to Canterbury, and he goes ahead and describes each pilgrim. The technical term for these descriptions of pilgrims is, interestingly, portraits. So Chaucer describes all of the pilgrims, and at the end of the general prologue, the owner of the Tabard Inn, Harry Bailey, proposes a game that he says will entertain the pilgrims. And the game involves each pilgrim telling two tales on the way to Canterbury and two tales on the way back. He says that whoever tells the best tale will get a free meal, and whoever does not follow his rules will have to pay everyone's expenses. All of the pilgrims agree to Harry's suggestion, and they agree that Harry will serve as their leader and travel with them on the way to Canterbury. The pilgrims draw straws. They determine who is going to go first, and then the Canterbury Tales themselves begin, starting with the knight. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the general prologue. I'm going to talk about a primary way in which people in the Middle Ages understood the ordering of society, and this goes back centuries before Chaucer. It goes back to the 10th century. It's called the Three Estates. The Three Estates involve, first of all, the first estate, which is the estate of those who pray. the spiritual rulers. This means the clergy, everything from the Pope on down to a humble parish priest. When people discussed estates, they would describe the ideal version of a member of an estate, and they'd also describe the corruptions that are associated with a particular estate. Ideally, members of the first estate, the clergy, would model a good Christian life, right? They'd live a Christ-like life. The second estate shifts from the category of the spiritual to that of the secular. It concerns temporal rulers. It concerns the aristocracy. Everything from a king or an emperor on down to a knight, or even at the smallest scale, an esquire like Chaucer. The aristocracy consisted of a very, very small portion of the population of medieval England. If we just think about knights and higher, we're talking about 0.5% of the population. Ideally, members of this estate were to defend the church, defend their country. Corrupt members of this group were criticized for being greedy and lecherous. Finally, we turn to the third estate. This is the vast majority of the people in medieval England. And if the first estate involves spiritual rulers, the second estate involves temporal rulers, this third estate is all about the ruled, or those who serve, the peasants. Ideally, peasants were supposed to happily accept their lot, their servile lot, and work to feed and support everyone else. Corrupt peasants would rebel against that status. The teller of the tale that we are reading in this class, the miller, is a member of this estate. Let's talk about women. They tend not to appear in discussions of the three estates. They form a kind of fourth estate. When they are described in any sort of, in terms of their organization, they tend to be described in terms of lay women versus women of the church, so nuns versus wives, or they're described in terms of their stages of life. For example, a virgin, a married woman, and then a widow. And then there's a category, it wasn't an official category, this is a term that scholars use, called the new men. These are figures who do not fit into the three estates. They don't fit into the received idea of the social order. They tend to be professionals, and they tend to overlap with the emergence of capitalism in medieval England. If we turn to the general prologue, we see members of all of these different estates, as well as new men, as members of the Canterbury pilgrimage. Fascinatingly, really, tons of new men. Harry Bailey, the host, right? He's a businessman. He is a new man. Chaucer, even though Chaucer has a foot in the aristocracy as an esquire, he's also very much a member of this estate of new men. He also has links with other new men, like the man of law. I referred to the fact that Chaucer, for example, was a justice of the peace in Kent. And then we do have some women. There are 2 nuns, as well as the very famous, rightly famous character, the wife of Bath. So as you read the general prologue, as you look at the miller's performance, think about how he fits into these issues. What might be the aims of the miller for being on this Canterbury pilgrimage? Is he engaging in pilgrimage for pious, holy reasons? Or maybe are there more profane desires mobilizing his presence on the Canterbury pilgrimage?